Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Transelerate's webinar on safety issue notification on evolving country regulatory expectations. This is a second of two webinars that we're holding, and I'm just going to move into the materials. Glad everyone could join us this evening. This is just the typical legal disclaimer that these materials are for informational purposes only. I'll just remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and everyone is in listen mode. I'd like to introduce our team members that are on the call today. First off, we have Jillian Winstanley, and Jillian is the Director Regional Safety Lead for Amgen, and she also led the safety issue notification team through this process of what we developed. In addition, we have with us Linda Lum. Linda is the Director of Global Pharmacovigilance and Epidemiology at Bristol Myers Squibb, and she is one of the team members. Doug Domelek is the Signal Detection Lead of the CMO organization at AstraZeneca. And myself, I am Leslie Ware, and I am the Transelerate Program Project Manager for this project. A couple of things that I just want to share with you. If you have any feedback, please report that or any technical issues to events@transeleratebiopharma.com. So that you can have the best experience out of this, I want to just point out a couple of things. First off, the orange button that you see in the upper corner. This orange button will allow, excuse me for a second. For that, so that we all, that you have a better experience on this, I just want to give you a little bit of information. You can reduce this upper left-hand corner GoToWebinar control panel by clicking on the orange and the white arrow in the upper right-hand corner. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar. You'll see that there is a questions area that you can type a question in, and then don't forget to press send to send us these questions. At the end of this webinar, we will have an opportunity to answer the questions you may have. We will use live polling during this webinar. It's a great way to have some interaction. All your participation is voluntary, and all responses are anonymous, and we aggregate them and show them in percentages. I'd like to go ahead and test this out. So to ensure that everything is working well, we'll just launch our test question now, which is, what's your favorite color? Great. So I'm seeing that blue is coming to the top, followed by red. So everybody has done a good job of managing the poll. I'm going to close out the poll now, and we'll move on into the rest of the webinar presentation. But before we do that, I will hit a few ground rules for you. First off, we want to make this discussion helpful and answer as many questions as you have. But in doing so, I want to just lay out some quick ground rules. First off, as I said, participation is voluntary in providing us with questions, as is using any of the Transelerate assets and tools. But please don't, you don't have to identify what company you work for. You can if you'd like, but you don't have to. We do ask that you do not bring up questions or discuss vendors, sites, or CROs. Any issues you may be having with a vendor, site, or CRO, please don't do that. Don't bring that up. Any of your long-term development plans or anything related to cost. And just so you're aware, we would not be able to answer questions on vendors, cost of using or implementing any of these Transelerate assets or tools, and which of our member companies are using those tools. For our webinar today, we will first start off with a very brief overview of who Transelerate is. We'll talk about project overview and scope. the proposed definitions and methodology here, and also give you a little bit of information on some proposals on the challenges that we found when we surveyed our member companies, and then we'll have some conclusions and resources, and we'll wrap up with an opportunity for you to ask questions. So before we get started, I have another question for you. What do you hope to get out of this webinar? And you can select all that apply to you. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Oh, good, right? So it's a lot of you are really looking to understand some of the other approaches and challenges. Definitely an interest in broader awareness of safety issue notification regulations, and an awareness of specific country requirements. So that is great. I'm very happy to have your feedback on that. Thank you very much. So we're going to move into the webinar now. I'll give a quick overview on Transcelerate. First off, for those of you that are not familiar with Transcelerate, it is a not-for-profit organization that's been created to foster collaboration. We have about 20 member companies from across all of these organizations. These are the individuals that contribute to the work that we do, and we hope to, in the work streams that we do, we engage in innovative discovery, development, and manufacturing of new medications.
Leslie, it's Gloria. Sorry, I think your slides are not being shared at this time. If you could unshare and share again.
Oh, sure. Thank you for that, Gloria. Okay, I will stop sharing,
Thank
and then I will start again.
Perfect. Thank you.
Is
now
it showing
sharing.
now? Good,
yep.
Great. Thank you for interrupting, Gloria, and telling me that. Okay, so these are the 20 member companies that we have that participate in Transcelerate. To give you a flavor for the types of initiatives that we cover, we focus in areas of harmonizing process and sharing information. We do initiatives that intend to improve the patient and site experience, and we also do initiatives that we hope enhance sponsor efficiencies and drug safety. In particular, in that area, this particular initiative runs under an initiative called Interpretation of Guidances and Regulations. So with that, I think we'll get into the meat of the presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Linda to give us just an overview and scope of what this project was about.
Leslie, so I think the slide seems to be stuck on the global membership is expanding slide. There we go. Now okay. We're up to Linda's. Thanks. Not sure what's happening there.
Okay. Thank you. All right,
Great.
Linda.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is the project overview and scope. So in the next slide, you'll be able to see the project objective, regardless of which pharmaceutical company we all are employed by. I think the key to all of the objectives is patient safety. So in our objectives for this Transcelerate team, that is why the objective of this project was for the support of patient safety. So we were committed to that. And also meeting the health authority expectations regarding safety notifications and safety issues. So with that, on the left-hand side, you will see what we included in scope. So the first bullet, as is stated, we considered the regulations applying to approved products, so marketed products. In our pre-questions, we received the comment regarding clinical trials. So this team, during our project, our interpretation of the regulations was that it was applied to the approved products or marketed products in the market. And then the second bullet you'll see is that we also considered the notification of safety issues, which also includes the emerging safety issues. So another pre-question that we also received was the question regarding the ICSRs, or the individual case safety reports, or the SUSARs, the suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reactions. So that was one area that we considered out of scope. So we considered these items in scope: the approved products, the safety issue notifications, including the safety issues, and we included these particular countries: Australia, Canada, Israel, New Zealand, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, and Turkey. We weren't able to include all countries and all regulations, so we had to narrow our scope to these items. So as stated, these were the items that were in scope. So the clinical trials as well as ICSRs and SUSARs were out of scope. Some of the challenges that arise that after we were working on this product, we found that the health authority expectations for the safety issues were evolving, and they continue to evolve today. So because it was moving as time was going, as companies are trying to meet those expectations varied from country to country, and they were evolving over time. So interpreting those became a challenge, and operationalizing those as well became a challenge. So in that middle box, you'll see these were considered our challenges. However, we kept our eye on the goal. So the goal was to deliver an implementation guide. So this guide was to aid industry, all of our colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry, to be able to meet the requirements for the signal and the safety notification requirements to the health authorities. And it's also to provide the awareness regarding these regulations and the ever-evolving regulations. So in the next slide. So as I stated, our methodology included that we scoped the project, we reviewed documents, the guidance documents for those 7 countries, we proposed reference definitions, we gathered MAH, so the marketing authorization holder, other pharmaceutical company insights, and we created this guide. So in the next slide. So as was stated, we included these 7 countries, which appear on the right, and it was to help to create a greater understanding of the safety notification requirements and the signals and safety issues. We scoured through the regulations and analyzed it and discussed it and tried to figure out the interpretation of the guidances. As we all know, some of them aren't always as clear, so some of it is left to interpretation, and different companies might interpret things differently, but we tried to provide information in the guide to be able to help to operationalize it and to meet the requirements of those countries. In the next slide. So that was part of our project, of our steps within the methodology. And as stated, when we reviewed the guidances, then we developed different reviews for those 7 countries. So we reviewed the relevant guidances and regulations, and then we reviewed the terminology. So the terminology, as in number 3 is stated, was in 2 categories: signals, which sometimes varied in how it was described in the regulations, and safety issues. So the different terminology by the different health authorities in the regulations that we reviewed, we tried to be able to identify the differences and the similarities among them. And the next slide. So as was stated, the differing terminologies by different health authorities, we tried to interpret them and to come up with a definition. So we tried to leverage the established definitions which were available. So in number 3 here, you'll see that we use the EMA guidances, so that being very clear as very structured as the backbone of the definitions, because when we reviewed each of the different countries, some of them had commonalities, some of them had differences, but each of the 7 regulations had their different nuances. So we tried to apply those common terms and then qualify them. So the next slide. So as we went through the regulations and as we tried to identify different areas of how to operationalize, we created a survey. So many of you contributed to that survey. So thank you for your input and your contributions in providing insight regarding the evolving regulations in the local market in these 7 countries. So some of the challenges included the timeline. So about 60% of the member companies, so these are the Transcelerate member companies, 60% of us responded that the timelines were challenging based on the triggers and the endpoints. Some of them were timelines of 72 hours, some of them 30 days, 90 days, as well as was it when a signal is validated, or does it include refuted signals? So the timeline regarding the stage of the signals, as well as the timeline, actually the calendar timeline. So also the tracking. So greater than 80% of the respondents stated that tracking. So it's tracking of awareness from a local standpoint as well as from the global standpoint, and whether companies considered it necessary to track these, especially among the various health authorities in various countries. And then the third item was communication. So the team members found that 50% of the member companies found that the communication was a challenge, and that it was difficult for between global as well as local, and between departments as well, between the pharmacovigilance department and the regulatory department. And then also, that's internally within the pharmaceutical company, but also between the pharmaceutical company and the health authority, that communication process and the timing of it. For number one, the timing, and then the communication, the mode of communication, the speed of communication, and then including number 4, which is identification of the relevant signals. So to identify which signals would be notified to the health authority. That was also a challenge, in that does it include actions imposed by the health authority, like for label updates, and or what types of information would be included. So sometimes it's subjective of what is relevant or what is significant, and those were difficult to determine whether or not these should be reported to the health authority or not. As well, the amount of information. So greater than 60% of our respondents in the survey discussed, that it was difficult for them to identify the amount of information. Was it too much or too little, or how much should be included? And in the format as well. Some health authorities identified a specific form or the very templated format of how it should be included, but it was also interpretation of the amount of information. So some of the feedback was received that the content was lacking, whether it wasn't enough information, and depending on the timing of it, which goes to number 1, how much available information is known about the signal at the time. So on the next slide, I'll turn it over to my knowledgeable colleague, Doug, who will be discussing the proposed definitions and the methodology that the project team went through.
Thank you very, very much, Linda. Hello, everyone. For this presentation, I'll be covering the definitions we used based on our interpretation of the regulatory requirements for signal reporting to the countries that are in scope, as Linda had mentioned, and the rationale by which we came to those definitions. I'm also going to be presenting a flowchart that provides a high-level overview of an example process to manage and submit notification of signals to those health authorities in scope. Next slide, please. So one of the main struggles we encountered in our working group is the varied or vague definitions used by the health authorities and their regulations regarding signals, as Linda had mentioned earlier. Some of those terms that were used were safety issues, other terms were used were signal, without being clear if a signal was considered valid. Also, what constituted a valid signal was not clearly defined either. So to address this, we took an approach to use the EMEA's GVP definitions as a common standard and modify them slightly so that they would closely align with the language used across all the local regulations for the countries in scope. The purpose, as stated, is on the slide, which was to help reduce operational challenges to meet these countries' guidances. The orange text under each of the definitions that you see reflects our modification of the GVP definition and helps identify the source where the signal originates. It should be noted, though, we did not include a definition for refuted signals in this slide deck, but the guidance document that we produced does provide that definition. But for your awareness, we didn't deviate from the definition provided in GVP for a refuted signal, just in case you're wondering. I won't read through these definitions in the interest of time, but an internally validated signal is a signal identified through your routine internal signal detection activities, which results in the identification of a validated signal that would warrant further investigation. So we use the same definition for external signals, and really the only difference is the source of where the signal is originating from. There was a discussion amongst ourselves about what were the types of notifications from an agency that would constitute an external signal. Based on what we saw from the regulations, we considered externally validated signals sources to encompass the following: questions from regulatory authorities that require analysis of safety data by your company, questions from regulatory authorities that have undergone analysis validity by the agency that's providing you that signal, health authority requests and negotiations that may impact the safety. So such things would be including and updating the label. And then for an example of that, for these types of requests would be information or notifications that come from PRAC or the FDA issuing a track safety issue or a TSI. What we considered that was not in scope were questions related to individual cases, such as follow-ups to submissions that have already been provided. The emerging safety issue definition, we only slightly modified to include notifications from competent authorities, but ultimately we followed the definition of any signal that has a major impact on the risk-benefit profile of the product. Next slide, please. So to dive a little deeper into the definitions, here's a list of the thinking and rationale we use to apply what is considered a valid signal. It's understood that your company or organization may have a different definition or threshold for what you consider a valid signal, but this is what we basically worked under these assumptions. We know that all signals undergo evaluation regardless of the source. We assume that all signals from a health authority are considered validated, although we know this may not be the case for some companies. You still go through a validation process, obviously. The definition of validated signal encompasses all types of signals required by in-scope health authorities. For example, in Israel, the Ministry of Health refers to adverse events observed outside of Israel, which are considered as AEs affecting the product safety or requiring attention, to be a signal and therefore considered valid. Per the regulations of the in-scope countries, a different subset of validated signals requires notification in each country. How your definition of a signal aligns with that country's regulation is going to drive your reporting. Next slide, please. So for emerging safety issues, when reviewing the regulation of countries in scope, they were basically all saying the same thing with slight modifications in wording, but the commonality was that the signals that impacted the benefit risk profile of the product required expedited notification, usually within the matter of a few days. And this was an additional requirement beyond just the standard signal notification. We only slightly modified the emerging safety issue definition to include signals flagged by a market authorization holder or competent authorities. Market authorization holders should apply their current definition of what is considered as an emerging safety issue and then determine if it meets that threshold and requires urgent notification to other countries besides those in scope for early signal notification. Next slide, please. So taking these definitions of internally and externally validated signals and emerging safety issues, we applied them to the current in-scope country signal reporting regulations. We also considered feedback we received from our respective affiliates on their interpretation of their country's regulations. We'd sent out a survey and asked them these questions. We developed this chart to help visualize which countries require what types of signals to be reported early. I'm not going to go through this chart line by line, just like I didn't want to go through all the definitions just in the interest of time. But in summary, as you can see, all countries require notification of emerging safety issues. The variability you'll see is on the source of the signal, whether internally or externally driven, and the variances of what is considered a valid signal. It should be noted that Australia just recently is evolving and clarifying their regulations to state signals considered as significant safety issues require notification to the TGA. This includes signals from comparable health authorities, which is displayed in the chart, but also validated internal signals requiring notification. We're going to, and as Linda had stated before, these regulations are constantly evolving and changing, so we're going to have to go back and update this chart once we get confirmation of that from the TGA. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, when I was introducing the presentation, I'm now displaying an example process flow of how a signal received externally or identified internally could be processed for eventual notification to a health authority. This flowchart provides a high-level mapping from the time a signal is received or identified, assessed and validated, and a response being sent to the health authority. As you can see, at various points in the evaluation process, a signal may be provided to a country based on their signal reporting requirements. So these points are as follows, as outlined in the flowchart. Notification of the initial request or safety query, notification of the completed assessment for the confirmed or refuted signal, notification of the agreed actions between the health authority and the market authorization holder, if different than what was stated in the conclusion of the completed company assessment. Although this process for safety queries or notices should always be assessed to determine if they qualify as emerging safety issues, in those instances, all the impacted health authorities will be reported, not just those that have local reporting for expedited notification. Next slide, please. All right. So this concludes my part of the presentation, and now I'm going to hand the remaining sections over to my colleague and our fearless leader in our working group, Gillian Winstanley.
Great, thanks so much, Doug. So we're now going to move to the specific recommendations that the team have developed to address the major challenges that were identified through the survey of member companies. So let's start with the first challenge. So if you recall from Linda's summary, challenges were identified around timelines, and particularly with regards to understanding the triggers for signal notifications and receiving notification of a signal in a timely manner. And it's important to understand the trigger points for each of the major steps in your signal management pathway. So for example, when do you consider receipt of a signal? When do you consider a signal is validated? Because these are the decision points that will trigger communication of a safety notification in a particular country. For example, Swissmedic should be informed of the results following the closure of the signal evaluation by specified authorities. So how do you know when a signal is closed by an authority and you can trigger that communication? Another example is for Health Canada, who want to be notified regarding actions taken in a foreign country. We need to understand how you are consistently notified of this action. Within the notification guide, we have included details in our country-specific appendices regarding details of the timelines and the trigger points for each country. So for example, whether it's when the global or the local MA holder are aware of the information that triggers that reporting requirement. And we'll share those country-specific appendices with you at the end. So let's move on to the next challenge regarding tracking. Okay, the survey highlighted the importance of tracking signals that are submitted to local health authorities. And this tracking system should really include safety issues that are communicated to the affiliates and documenting the rationale for those that are not. In addition, from an audit and inspection point of view, it's important to track details of the communications and correspondence to the local health authority. And I would say most importantly, those signals that were not sent to the health authority and the rationale for not sending them. We know inspectors are looking at this in Canada, in Australia, as well as in Saudi Arabia. And in particular, we've heard that this has been a common inspection finding in Australia. Depending on how your company is set up, you should consider if Global needs to have oversight on what was or was not communicated to the local health authorities. And if oversight is preferred, then obviously the global tracking system should be designed to have access to this information. In addition, it's important to ensure that the responsibility for the notification decision to the health authority is clearly defined. So is this going to be a global decision or an affiliate decision to notify the health authority? And in this diagram, we included a visual to really describe these tracking mechanisms depending on who is accountable to the local health authority. And I think really the important takeaway is to have transparency in all of the actions taken regarding communication of signals and clear accountability. So let's move to the next slide. We actually have 3 slides around communication, and I think that really demonstrates kind of what we found, which is that communication is at the core of signal notification. And we've highlighted important considerations for communication from both a global and a local perspective. So let's start with the global perspective. So here, each company will need to decide how to manage communications. For example, should all affiliates be notified of all safety issues, or should only affiliates who have a guidance that requires them to be notified of specific issues be informed? And this really will depend on the size of your company, the number of products you have, number of affiliates, etc. And the other thing that I would stress is that it's important to consider that additional countries may come on board with these requirements. Although we only picked 7 countries for this project that had the very detailed requirements around signal notification, there are lots of other countries that have have one-liners basically in their regulations, and others such as Indonesia that are coming on board with more detailed requirements. And I think we're starting to see this as a trend from a number of countries. Another important aspect to consider is regarding the different sources of safety information. And within this, ensuring that you have clear roles and responsibilities for communication from these different sources, and an understanding of how this different safety information is received and disseminated within the company. So within the survey, actually one of the feedbacks that we received, and I think something we felt within our small team who were working on this, is that communication of actions imposed by a specific regulatory agency was one of the most challenging aspects. And it's important to understand who within your company may receive this type of agency correspondence and how you will get this information to the other affiliates. It's typically, if there is a request, let's say in China, it would come into your global office, it would be evaluated, there may be a negotiation with the Chinese authority, but it wouldn't necessarily be sent to all other affiliates if you didn't agree with it as a company. However, now certain countries want to receive these type of notifications. And linked with this, it's important to understand the roles and responsibilities for communication of the different types of information to the affiliates. So is the way that you communicate your routine safety issue notifications different to the way that you communicate your emerging safety issues? I think within the companies that we spoke to, there was generally different mechanisms, and so you really need to understand those different communication routes. So let's look at the communication challenges from the affiliate perspective. So affiliates are accountable to their local health authority. I think that's an important concept to understand. And within the affiliate, it's important to understand the roles and responsibilities for communication between the safety and regulatory functions, and who submits and who tracks the communication to the local health authority. Again, this will vary between companies. However, we do know of a situation where a regulatory team submitted a signal notification. However, the authority came back and asked for clarification from the safety team. And it just really stresses that at a local level, you need to communicate and you need to partner. It's also important at the local level to have links with your global organization to know where you can go to obtain clarification regarding a signal notification and your particular company position. So you may need to put that signal into context when you report it to the health authority, and having that communication link is really important. And as is stated in the takeaway box, when considering your communication sources from the global team, ensure the decision points regarding assessment of safety information are clearly documented and understood, and leveraging existing processes if possible. You may already be receiving several sources of information to meet these signal reporting requirements, but you need to pull them together essentially into a clear process. So on the next slide is a visual summary of the importance of communication. So this is a representation of a possible process flow of internal and externally initiated signals. And you can see in this example that local health authority A may initiate a request. The request is then forwarded from the local office to the global team for evaluation and decision making. And this decision making then around onward communication of that information to the impacted affiliates may occur either manually or via a system. So manually, obviously you're relying on somebody to make that decision and send an email, or via a system in that you could have periodic outputs, let's say weekly or monthly outputs from your signal management system to notify your affiliates, or you could add your requirements for a particular country to your signal management system. And then we can see that signals may be shared with multiple affiliates or sent to a specific affiliate only. And of course, depending on your roles and responsibilities, there may be another decision point at that time regarding the need to send to a particular health authority. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So with regard to identification of relevant signals, identifying and determining that a signal meets the criteria for health authority notification is a key decision point. As previously mentioned, it's important to understand your process and trigger points so that you can clearly identify when you need to action either an internally validated or externally validated signal. For example, it's important to understand if both internal and external signals are captured in the same system consistently, or if they are tracked separately. In addition, it's helpful to determine the criteria for what is an emerging safety issue that requires notification as per the applicable local country regulations. So for example, you could map this term to your company defined risk levels, and that's a way of identifying those emerging safety issues. From an affiliate point of view, it's important to understand the internal definitions and criteria for communication of the various types of issues to you. For example, can you ensure that there is a mechanism to inform you of the various types of safety data that you need to communicate? And overall, the recommendation is whether it's one or multiple processes, MAHs should create a notification process to include internally validated signals, externally validated signals, and emerging safety issue. So let's move on to our last slide regarding recommendations for challenges. Of course, once you have decided you have a safety topic to submit, then you need to decide exactly what you're going to share and what you're going to say. And most authorities are quite vague regarding the amount of information to submit. However, we suggest considering the following for a safety issue raised by another health authority, and that is which health authority made the query, what are the details of the query, the response that was submitted to the requesting health authority, as well as the action taken by the MAH that was agreed upon with the requesting health authority, and the MAH's company stance. So what can happen is that the MAH may disagree with the requesting health authority, and you may be required to implement a certain action in that specific country, but you don't want to implement it in all of the countries. And if that's the case, then you would need to provide an appropriate rationale to explain why that action is not relevant in any other country. And it may be possible to use one format for multiple countries, particularly when the health authority has not specified a particular format. And also, I would say it's common practice that if a response has already been provided to one authority, then this response can be shared with other authorities who need this information, and this really avoids any rework. So in conclusion, the content in the communications to health authorities should provide enough information for the health authority to understand the safety issue, the data that supports your conclusion, as well as your final conclusion. So now we're going to move on to the conclusions from our project. Okay, so as you know, this topic is continuously evolving and it's quite dynamic. And I think as Linda mentioned, even since this work stream started, we have received updated clarifications from Swissmedic and the TGA. And as is the norm within pharmacovigilance, robust processes, clear communication links, as well as defined roles and responsibilities will enable successful operationalization. And as you can see from the Transcelerate recommendations, although the language used and the definition of signals and safety issues varies between countries, the application of standard GVP definitions can aid in effective operationalization. Our next slide summarizes some of the resources available to you. So this slide is in our guidance document, and it provides links to the key circulars and presentations that each regulatory authority has developed around this topic. And this is, as I say, in the implementation guide, so you will have access to this. In addition, on the next slide, we have included screenshots that summarize the country-specific appendices we have included. So you can see for each country, you have a link to your guidance documents, and as well as relevant excerpts from the guidance documents that are linked to the Transcelerate definitions that we presented earlier. And we also include a summary of the timelines, methods of notification, etc. Additional resources that we have are on the next slide. And here you can find a link to the notification guide. So this is the full guide that we produced. So today, the slides that we presented were just a summary of that guide, but that complete guide is available to you. In addition, the recording of this webinar will also be available shortly, and I believe you'll get an email when that is made available. So Leslie, I think we want to move on to our final audience poll, and then we can move on to the Q&A section. Okay, so how likely are you to use these Transcelerate resources? Okay, great. So we've got about 60% very likely and 50% very likely, 40% likely. So that's pretty good. So I think just 10% unlikely. So that's a really great result. So thank you for that. And I think we can open it up to questions if there are any questions. We have some that were pre-submitted, and there may be some in the chat box as well. So please feel free to send through any questions.
So Jillian, while we're waiting for the current audience to provide some questions, there are a couple that came in earlier. And one of the ones that came in is, what advice would you give to a mid-size or small pharma company that feels they're always taking the conservative approach in reporting everything?
Yeah, so Doug, Linda, any comments on that question?
Yeah, so my initial thoughts on that are I don't like to give like hard, fast recommendations on how your company should do their business, but I think that when you're considering, reporting just about every signal that you receive, you need to consider the resource implications on that. And also, you do decrease your risk for notifying, obviously for missing a notification to a regulatory agency if you submit everything. But then there also, you kind of couple that risk with the additional work that might come from queries that are raised on a signal. There's always going to be additional follow-ups that are going to be submitted saying, what's the outcome of that signal? Can you give us any more updates on it? There's usually a lot more work that's generated on that, but you need to couple that with the balance of what you identify as a particular signal and when you determine the need to be able to report it. So I wouldn't suggest against it, but you need to kind of weigh the pros and cons and the options as to whether this is something that fits in line with your signal detection and management process, and can you manage the additional work that's going to come from submitting every signal that you receive.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would, oh, sorry, go ahead, Linda.
No, okay. Oh, no, sorry. I was just going to say I would agree. And I think that, as we stated, for the company to have their own company position regarding the definition of it's some of it is subjective of what is significant or what is relevant or what is important. So to be able to identify what does or does not get submitted, and then perhaps either to define who is that decision maker and what forum will it be in. So if there is a question or if there is needs discussion on determining if it does get sent or not, so there needs to be a mechanism to determine that. So that process has to be defined within the company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, often companies will have definitions of certain risk level, whether you call that 1, 2, or 3, A, B, or C, about what risk level of information is, whether it's a minor impact to benefit risk, significant impact. And I think you can align it to those definitions as well in-house. I think the other thing I would say is that we know from some authorities, I think particularly Saudi Arabia, they had given feedback to companies after they had launched this requirement to say, please stop sending us certain things. So I think at some point as well, you don't want to be overwhelming the regulatory authority.
Thank you all, Jillian and Linda and Doug. That was a great response there. We certainly do have a couple other questions, and I just remind everyone that on the panel, to go to webinar panel, you do have the option of putting questions in. It's a gray line that says questions, and you can add a question and just make sure you hit that send button. So we have a question that's come in from the listening audience. Will a notification be sent if the guide is updated? I might start with an answer there and say that Transcelerate does have an opportunity for you to be on a mailing list if you'd like to. That certainly is an easy thing to do by going to the Transcelerate website and adding your name to that email list. That certainly is a way that if the guide is updated, that you would be notified. Jillian and Linda, Doug, do you have any other thoughts on that? If we have an intent to just generally update the guide as guidances change.
Yeah, I mean, I think from our point of view, this, our Transcelerate initiative was set up as a project team, and like all projects, it has a beginning and an end. So I think there's not within Transcelerate, because it would probably be a full-time job, we're not continuously monitoring for changes in the regulations to kind of keep this guide live. It is a point in time. But what I would say is I think two things. If we got specific feedback from a health authority, I think we would be obliged or feel obliged to update that guide and make that updated guide available. So I think that's, one aspect to consider. And I think the other piece is, we very consciously, when we set up this guide, created it in a way with the definitions and the recommendations that as new countries came on board, that they could kind of be slotted into this framework because, you know, those standard definitions should really be able to encompass new requirements that come up from new countries as well. So I would say that even if there are new countries, even if there are slight changes, I think the framework that we've developed should be robust enough to handle that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jillian. I'm glad you brought that up, because if you hadn't spoke to it, I was going to, is that, you know, we did put a lot of time and effort to be able to give our proposals, highlight the areas that we know are kind of the pain points when you're looking at these regulations and determining, okay, how are we going to address this and tackle this reporting requirements in our particular country. So we tried to be as general and all-encompassing as possible, and understanding that these regulations are constantly evolving and changing. And you know, I think if you look at the industry and you look at regulatory agencies as a whole, you can see that there's just this continuing thirst for information much sooner and much faster, and they want to be able to get an understanding of where a signal is coming from at a much earlier process, so they can determine, you know, what additional actions need to get taken in their particular location, and then also what are other regulatory agencies doing. So we try to be as general as possible in our recommendations, but as you said, Jillian, if there's something specific that comes up, we can definitely try to look to update the guidance.
Okay,
Excellent,
maybe
thank you.
here's another question. Let's see, I'll maybe ask Doug or Linda if you would like to field this. Would a Dear Healthcare Professional letter issued in another country qualify as something to communicate to local authorities?
That's a good one. I was thinking about that one. I would probably, my general answer to that would probably be yes, because generally a Dear Healthcare Professional letter is being driven by something that's being seen. So you obviously have identified a signal or a potential issue that need to communicate out to a regulatory agency and also to providers. So I would say that would be yes, but there's also specific regulations, especially Health Canada, where if there's a specific regulatory action that's taken as a result of a signal, and if that particular country is, say, in one country is updating their label, or another country determines that a Dear Healthcare Professional letter needs to be issued, then that does need to get reported back to Health Canada. So, I mean, I guess the quick answer for that for me would be, yeah, I would probably say yes, but I would look at what's the driver for that notification. So I would assume that would be a signal or something that was identified that impacted the benefit risk, so you needed to communicate that out. But also the action itself would also require notification in certain countries as well.
Great, thank you.
I agree with that
Anybody
response.
else? Go ahead, Jillian.
No, just to say, I agree. I think, you know, in general, you know, that would qualify. And we've seen, as Doug mentioned, Health Canada, and I think Australia as well, give these type of examples of actions that they want to hear about. And I think, you know, what's important, and what hopefully came across in our summary, is that, you know, I think previously where, you know, it's been a company has decided, you know, what they want to share. I think really the change that we're seeing from these health authorities is that they don't just want to rely on, you know, what the company thinks is relevant for that territory, but what other territories are doing. And so if other territories are sending a DHCP letter, they want to know about that.
I would agree, and I know that during our presentation, you know, I mentioned that sometimes there is some subjectivity of what is significant or what is relevant, but I think if something warranted a Dear Healthcare Professional letter, then that's something that the company's position is that it impacts public health enough to be able to widely distribute some information regarding, as Doug said, perhaps that signal or whatever that safety issue is. So I would agree that transparency, and in today's world, different health authorities have access to their other counterpart countries' websites and postings, and so it's a very different world that we live in today with the transparency of safety notifications and safety issues.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So I just want to as we're coming close to the top of the hour, just give a little bit of time to each of our panelists for leaving us with any last thoughts. So Jillian, can we start with you? Any last thoughts that you would want to share with our webinar attendees?
Yeah, I think for me, in terms of last thoughts, is really that this is, as we said in our conclusions, a constantly evolving kind of area. And so, you know, I'm hoping this will be a framework that companies can use as new countries come on board. But I think, you know, be aware that this is a trend in how regulatory authorities are going. And so, you know, don't just develop your process specifically for one or two countries that you may have, but think broader, because it's likely that other countries will impact you shortly too.
Linda, any last thoughts from you?
I think, you know, like I said, we created a survey, so we scoped the project, we identified the 7 countries, we reviewed and scoured through the regulations as a team and came up with a proposed definition, and we surveyed many of you who contributed to the survey, and then we created this guide. So this guide is a tool to help you to have ideas and suggestions on how to conquer the challenges and meet those regulatory requirements. So as stated, we don't give advice, and we don't say that these are the standards that you absolutely must do and mandate, but this is what our objective was, to aid other pharmaceutical companies and our colleagues in the industry.
Oh, thank you, Linda. Very good points. Doug, anything from you?
Yeah, it just to kind of echo the sentiments that Jillian and Linda provided. You know, when this working group worked very closely together, we were very open and shared our personal and company experiences when trying to tackle these issues. So, you know what was born from all of this work was what you see in this guidance, and it is meant to help you. Take from our experience and our learnings of developing and looking at these regulations and kind of applying them to your particular company and your organization. So I think if you cover the points that we talk about, you have well-documented process, good communication lines, a good tracking method. It's all about transparency and being able to clearly express your company's position on why you submitted a particular signal or did not submit a particular signal. That's ultimately going to, just bear you fruit in the future. And again, and as Jillian said, this is going to be an evolving process. Regulations are going to change. They're going to, and we're hoping that we get more clarity from our regulatory agencies, specifically around their what they consider to be a signal and require notification. And we're starting to see that as as inspections are coming in and we're getting feedback from these agencies and we provide our feedback to them. I think you're going to see this start to get a little bit more clear as the time progresses. So yeah, so those are my final thoughts on this.
Thank you very much, Doug. I really appreciate it. So I want to thank everyone. This will conclude our webinar presentation. Thank you for joining us today, and definitely look for the guide itself on the Transcelerate website.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.